Hey, I have been thinking about this recently and thought I would share it with you guys. Back in the late 90s, my dad used to take the family to St. Osyth. It is a little town in the UK near the sea. They have holiday parks there where we stayed when we were little. My parents were into the supernatural and we used to go up to the beach and look for UFOs, as it was a bit of a hotspot there and we did see some weird things. Me and my sister were quite young and to be honest, it used to scare us. The roads up there are covered in trees and there's lots of bends in the roads. One day my dad decided to take us to the arcades up at St. Osyth and we arrived in the afternoon and me, my mom and sister went inside. We stayed for probably about an hour. When we came out and got in the car, my dad looked visibly shaken up and he said, "I'm so glad you guys came out, let's get out of here." And he sped off. He pulled over when we got nearer home. We asked what was wrong. My dad explained that while we were in the arcade, he had been looking around in the car. He was disabled and could hardly walk, so he would regularly just wait in the car. He spotted something strange in the sky, a round metallic object, and it was just hovering there for a while, and he was watching it. He then remembered that he had his binoculars in the glove box, so he got those out for a closer look. He saw this thing close for a few seconds and all of a sudden it took off real fast and seemed to duck behind a cloud. A couple of minutes later there's a knock in the car passenger side window. It was a man dressed in a black suit, sunglasses and hat. He said hello to my dad and asked what he was doing there, if he was alone or with family. Then he asked if dad had seen anything strange and my dad said no. And then the guy looked at his binoculars and asked what they were for and my dad said, "Oh, I'm just bird watching." My dad said this guy had an intimidating presence and tone and it scared him, hence why he felt like he needed to lie about what he just saw. He watched the man walk away for a bit, turned his head away, then back after a couple of seconds and then the man was gone, like he just vanished. My dad had a clear view of the guy and could not think where he went so fast. Dad was a serious guy and would not make something like this up. We still went back after, but my mom normally stayed in the car with him. So this video is a follow-up with more Men in Black stories like this one I just narrated. Although the next story is a bit different to the normal Men in Black sightings. I have seen things that I can't explain ever since I was young, but I usually find a way to explain it away. I am not a scared person, I am not afraid of the dark, and I love a good scary movie with ghosts, not gore. This event happened to me in 1998. I was driving along a one-way street that has 3 lanes. I was driving in the middle lane. I came to a traffic light that was red. I was 3 cars behind in the line. To my left and closer to the lights, there is a sidewalk that is parallel to the driveway and beside that driveway a little shopping plaza. I looked toward the plaza and there sitting on the back curb of the sidewalk was a man. I looked curiously at him because he was dressed in a black suit, like a business suit, with a black tie. He was also wearing a black rimmed hat, like a cowboy hat, and beside him was a black briefcase. It was about midday and a very hot and sunny day. I thought to myself, why is this man sitting there in the hot sun and dressed like that? And wondered if he is a street person or a beggar. But why does he have on a suit? He suddenly turned his head and looked straight into my eyes and kept a steady stare. I felt uncomfortable and uneasy, creeped out. I was far back in the traffic. Why would he be staring at me like that? I looked away and back and he was still staring at me. The light changed to green and as I was driving by, he kept his stare on me. I drove off and went home, still thinking how weird that was and how creepy he made me feel. I told my husband about this weird man and he said maybe he was waiting on someone. But why was he sitting there in the hot sun? Why not in the shade of the building? I asked. I went on with my day, trying not to think about him. The next morning my husband asked me to go to an electric shop to buy an item. When he told me where to buy it, I gasped. It was in the same plaza I saw the weird man. I told my husband that was the same place I saw the man in the suit, and if I went there and saw him, I won't go in. My husband said, "Don't go if you don't feel comfortable." But for some reason, I needed to go and satisfy myself that he was just a man and not some supernatural being or something, and that I was just being silly. I arrived at the plaza and parked near to the door of the shop. The store was just opening, so very few cars were parked there. I was able to look all around. There was no one around, and I did not see the man anywhere. I breathed a sigh of relief and felt better to enter the shop. The shop entrance had 4 steps up to the door. I stopped at the top and had another look around, no one other than the traffic moving along. Inside was a long counter, sort of like a bank, with 4 windows to purchase items. I was the only customer. 2 windows were open beside each other, with a sales rep at each. Behind the reps were 2 other workers moving around. Everyone looked at me and we all exchanged good mornings. I went to the last window on the right. The door to the shop is now behind me and to my left. I was more relaxed now as I ordered what I needed, and the rep sent another worker for the items and she collected the payment for them. As I waited, I turned to look at entrance door, and there coming up the steps was that man wearing the same black suit, hat and the briefcase in hand. My heart nearly popped out of my chest. I felt the blood rush from my face. Where did he come from? How did he get here so fast, and why is he coming in here? He opened the door slowly and walked in. He walked towards me, staring at me. His eyes were dark and I am not sure if he was smiling or had no expression. I was just so frightened. He walked slowly over to the counter next to me and turned to face the window beside me. He had his head slightly down. The lady sitting at that window did not look up from what she was doing. He said nothing to her. He just stood there. As a matter of fact, no one even looked at him from behind the counter. I was frozen for that moment. I turned back to my cashier and used my peripheral vision to watch him. He just stood there facing the second lady. I wanted to ask if anyone else saw him, but I was so frightened and could not speak. It seemed like forever that I was standing there, but I am sure it was just a few seconds. The man started to slowly turn his head towards me. I was just about to run out of the shop, leaving my items behind, when the cashier handed me my bag. I ran from the shop, looking behind me as I opened the door. He was slowly heading towards the door also. I ran down the steps and fumbled for my keys and got into my car as quickly as I could. I looked up at the shop door as he exited. He was still staring at me with a grin. I drove off as fast as I could. I looked behind me as I drove away and saw him still watching me as he walked down the steps. I do not know who or what that was or what he wanted, but I am glad he did not get in my car. I felt like that's what he wanted, to come with me. I avoided driving on that road for a long time. I eventually drove past there with my husband, but never saw him again. I have not been to that shop or in that plaza again. It still gives me chills, even to this day. Yes, in this case UFOs weren't involved, although we can't say for sure because the witness's family might be involved in that stuff. But I don't want to suggest that everyone who wears a black suit and black hat has to be the Man in Black. Interestingly enough, when reading this story, I got the vibes of sleep paralysis, but like while being awake. Anyway, moving on. I grew up in rural Massachusetts, and our neighbors were an older couple that had a farm where my mother kept a couple of her horses. At the time, my parents were in their mid to late 30s, and this couple, we will call them Lisa and Gerard, were probably in their mid to late 50s. I should mention here that when I was around 8, my father introduced me to the world of UFO knowledge during a long road trip. He brought me up to speed on everything from Betty and Barney to the Majestic 12. Suffice to say, I was hooked on, and from then on I devoured every piece of UFO literature I could get my hands on. When Lisa and Gerard told me this story, it was probably 1989 or 1990, well before the X-Files or the Grey Alien being a fixture of pop culture. Anyway, one day while I was visiting Lisa and Gerard's house with my parents, I asked in passing if either of them had ever seen a UFO. I asked pretty much everyone this question when I was a kid, and they chuckled. Gerard began to recount something that occurred while they were at a horse show in New Hampshire. Apparently, this particular horse show was next to a lake, and in the late afternoon/early evening, the lake began to glow. Crowds gathered around the shoreline and watched as the light grew stronger and stronger, and after about an hour, a large silver disc slowly rose up out of the lake, became stationary about 10,000 feet above the water, and then slowly moved off and out of sight. I was of course flabbergasted by their account, but it got better, because then Lisa really threw me for a loop when she said, "And Gerard, do you remember those weird men in suits that suddenly showed up?" I instantly suspected that she was referring to MIB. When I inquired further, she said, "Oh gee, they were just so strange looking, as if their skin was made of wax, and one of them wouldn't stop smiling." I get chills to this day thinking about this, because here was Lisa and Gerard, simple horsefolk talking about a waterborne UFO and the freaking Men in Black. When I asked what the Men in Black talked about, they said that they were doing interviews with the witnesses and asking them to describe what they saw. Lisa and Gerard didn't indicate that the MIB were hostile, nor instructing anyone to forget what they saw. At least this wasn't the case for them. Interestingly enough, the story ends there. The weird men in suits left without incident, and everyone returned to what they were doing prior to the sighting. I, of course, asked if they had photographs of the event, and while they personally did not, they said that there were professional photographers present, and even a movie camera documenting the sighting, so somewhere out there is evidence of this. Whether the MIB confiscated the film, I do not know. I would love to one day find someone else who also witnessed this, because according to Lisa and Gerard, there were about 100 people that observed the occurrence. I have noticed that these stories of MIB sightings are quite old, so nowadays they seem to have disappeared maybe? Nevertheless, I am interested in this topic and I will return to it in the future, and hopefully we'll be doing a research on the MIB, and also if you have got a story to tell, feel free to share it, and I will see you later.